The wedding dress hung in tatters, its silk fabric torn by thorns and stained with blood from desperate flight through the Colorado wilderness. Emma Walsh clutched her baby brother to her chest, as his fevered whimpers echoed through the abandoned mine shaft where they'd taken shelter. Behind her, 7-year-old Tommy tried to comfort 5-year-old Katie, whose tears had long since dried into silent terror. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mama said to keep them safe. Emma whispered to herself, the words becoming a prayer in the darkness. Mama said to never let him have them. Through the crack in the rocks above, she could hear the distant baying of bloodhounds. Vincent Crane's men were getting closer, their torches casting dancing shadows against the canyon walls. The man who called himself her husband, who had paid her father's debts in exchange for her hand, would not stop until he found them. And when he did, Emma knew the bruises on her arms would be nothing compared to what awaited her children. The baby's cries grew weaker, his small body burning with fever. Tommy's stomach growled audibly in the silence. They had been running for 3 days with nothing but the bread crusts Emma had stolen from Crane's kitchen. How much further could they go? How much longer could they hide? A shadow passed over the mine entrance, and Emma pressed herself deeper into the darkness, her heart hammering so loud she was certain it would give them away. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, deliberate and measured. Not the frantic searching of Crane's hired thugs, but something else. Someone else. I know you're in there. A deep voice called, calm but commanding. You're safe now, I'm not with them. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The voice was rough, weathered by mountain winds and years of solitude. But there was something in its tone that made her want to believe. Still she remained frozen, clutching the children closer. My name is Jake Mitchell, the voice continued. I live up on Eagles Ridge. I've been watching those men hunt you for 2 days now, and I figure anyone running that hard from Vincent Crane deserves help, not harm. At the mention of Crane's name, Emma felt both terror and a flicker of hope. This stranger knew who they were running from. That meant he understood the danger they were all in simply by being here. Your baby needs medicine, Jake's voice softened. I can hear him crying from out here. Whatever Crane did to make you run, it can't be worse than watching that child suffer. Emma looked down at baby Luke's flushed face, felt the heat radiating from his tiny body. The stranger was right. Fear had kept them alive this long, but it wouldn't save Luke now. Sometimes survival meant taking the greatest risk of all might, trusting someone. Slowly, Emma emerged from the shadows of the mine, still clutching Luke while Tommy and Katie pressed close behind her. The man waiting outside was nothing like what she had expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, yes, but his weathered face held gentle eyes that seemed to catalog her injuries with quiet fury. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his clothes spoke of a man comfortable with solitude and hard work. Please don't hurt me, Emma begged, her voice barely a whisper. The words came automatically after months of Crane's cruelty, a desperate plea that had become as natural as breathing. Jake Mitchell looked at this woman in her torn wedding dress, holding 3 children who weren't old enough to understand the evil that pursued them. And something shifted in his chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 8 long years began to crack and thaw. Without a word, he dropped to his knees in the dirt before her, bringing himself to her eye level so she wouldn't have to crane her neck to look up at him. His hands remained at his sides, open and non-threatening. Miss, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. I would rather cut off my own hands than cause you or these children one moment's pain. You have my word on that. 8 years earlier, Jake Mitchell had been a different man entirely. He'd owned a successful timber operation in Pine Valley, employed half the town, and was planning to marry Anna Hartwell, the daughter of the local banker. Life had seemed to spread before him like a map of conquered territory. Every goal within reach, every dream attainable. That was before the climbing accident that took Anna's life and shattered Jake's faith in both God and his own ability to protect those he loved. The rescue attempt had lasted 3 days, with Jake refusing to leave the cliff face even as hypothermia set in and his fingers bled from clawing at the rocks. When they finally pulled Anna's broken body from the ravine, something essential in Jake died with her. The timber business was sold within a month. The house in town was abandoned. Jake disappeared into the high country of Eagle's Ridge, building a cabin so remote that even the hardiest trappers avoided the area. For 8 years he'd lived as a ghost among the living, coming down to Pine Valley only when supplies ran critically low, speaking to no one except Doc Harrison, who'd been Anna's friend and understood the particular weight of guilt that could crush a man's soul. The people of Pine Valley spoke of him in hushed tones, the way one might discuss a legend or a cautionary tale. Mountain Jake, they called him, though never to his face on the rare occasions he appeared in town. Children dared each other to hike toward Eagle's Ridge, though none had ever seen his cabin and returned to tell about it. Some said grief had driven him mad. Others claimed he'd become something less than human, more wolf than man, after so many years of isolation. The truth was simpler and more painful. Jake Mitchell had become a man so afraid of losing someone again that he'd chosen to lose everyone preemptively. His cabin was perfectly maintained. His hunting and fishing skills had kept him well fed, and his mind remained sharp despite the solitude. But his heart had been encased in ice so thick that he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. That morning, Jake had been checking his trap lines on the lower slopes when he'd heard the dogs. Crane's bloodhounds were expensive animals, bred for persistence and trained to hunt human prey. Jake had encountered them once before, years ago, when Crane had used them to track down a family of claim jumpers who dared to work an abandoned mine on what Crane considered his territory. The memory of what had happened to that family still soured Jake's stomach. Following the sound, Jake had positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the valley and watched through his field glasses as Emma Walsh ran through the forest, 3 children in tow, pursued by a dozen of Crane's hired men. Even from a distance, Jake could see her desperation, the way she clutched the baby while trying to keep the older children moving. He'd recognized the torn wedding dress immediately. Everyone in 3 counties knew about Crane's marriage to the Walsh girl, a transaction disguised as romance to satisfy social conventions. What Jake hadn't expected was his own reaction to watching her flight. For 8 years, he'd successfully
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He avoided entangling himself in other people's problems. He'd watched miners lose their claims to Crane's legal manipulations, seen families driven from their homes when they couldn't pay his inflated prices for supplies, observed the slow strangulation of Pine Valley as Crane's influence grew. Each time, Jake had told himself it wasn't his fight, that he'd lost the right to play hero when he'd failed Anna so completely. But something about Emma Walsh's desperate run through the wilderness had awakened feelings Jake thought he'd buried forever. Perhaps it was the way she moved, always keeping herself between the children and their pursuers. Perhaps it was the sight of that ridiculous wedding dress, so out of place in the harsh mountain terrain, serving as a symbol of everything Crane represented best. The corruption of innocence, the purchase of what should never be for sale. Or perhaps it was simply that Jake had been alone so long that witnessing genuine love in action reminded him of who he used to be. Whatever the reason, Jake had found himself moving through the forest, using skills learned from years of hunting to stay ahead of both the pursuers and the pursued. He'd watched Emma make increasingly desperate choices, leading the children higher into terrain that would be impassable with a sick baby. He'd seen her pause at stream crossings, trying to decide between speed and concealment. Most heartbreakingly, he'd witnessed the moment she'd realized that baby Luke's fever was becoming critical, watched her press her lips to the child's forehead and close her eyes in what could only be described as prayer. When Emma had finally taken shelter in the old mine shaft, Jake had positioned himself to observe Crane's men as they searched the area. Their leader was a man named Burton, Crane's chief enforcer, known throughout the territory for his casual brutality. Jake had listened to Burton organize the search, heard him tell his men that Crane wanted the woman and children brought back alive, but that some roughing up might be necessary to ensure future compliance. That was when Jake Mitchell had made his choice. For the first time in 8 years, he would step out of the shadows and involve himself in someone else's fight. Not because he believed he could save them. His failure with Anna had taught him the limits of his power. But because sometimes a man had to act according to who he used to be, even when he no longer believed in happy endings. Now kneeling in the dirt before Emma Walsh and her 3 children, Jake felt the weight of that choice settling around him like a mantle he'd thought he'd never wear again. The woman before him was clearly terrified, not just of Crane but of him, of any man large enough to overpower. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that might have been beautiful if not for the purple bruise along her jaw and the haunted look in her green eyes. The children clustered behind her like chicks seeking shelter, the oldest boy trying to look brave despite the fear written across his young features. The little girl sucked her thumb while clutching a cloth doll that had seen better days. And the baby Jake's throat tightened as he looked at the infant's flushed face and heard the rattling quality of his breathing. "He needs willow bark tea," Jake said quietly, gesturing toward the baby. "And warm broth. There's pneumonia in his chest, and it'll get worse fast at this altitude." Emma's grip on the child tightened. "I don't have money to pay for medicine." "I'm not asking for payment," Jake replied. "I'm offering help." The skepticism in Emma's eyes was painful to witness. How long had it been since someone had offered her help without expecting something in return? What had Crane done to her to create such deep distrust? "Why?" she asked simply. Jake considered several answers. Because Crane was a bastard who deserved to lose something he valued. Because those children reminded him of the family he'd never had. Because helping them might somehow balance the scales for his failure to save Anna. All of those reasons contained truth, but none captured the complete answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I've spent 8 years doing nothing while good people suffered. Maybe it's time I remembered how to be useful." Emma studied his face, searching for deception or ulterior motive. Jake remained perfectly still, letting her take whatever time she needed. He understood that trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt with words alone. Finally, she nodded. "If you're lying, if you're working for him, we're already dead anyway." Jake stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "My cabin is about 3 miles up the ridge. It's well hidden, and Crane's men don't know these trails. We can be there before dark if we move carefully." "I can't carry him much further," Emma admitted, looking down at the baby. "He's getting heavier, and I'll carry him," Jake offered. "And the little girl if she gets tired. The boy looks like he's got good legs on him." Tommy straightened at the compliment, puffing out his thin chest. "I can walk anywhere," he declared. "I'm strong, I can see that," Jake said solemnly. "I'll need you to help watch out for your sisters while we travel. That's an important job." The boy nodded eagerly, clearly desperate for some sense of purpose in their chaotic flight. Jake remembered being that age, wanting nothing more than to be useful, to matter in the adult world that seemed so large and complicated. "What about Crane's men?" Emma asked. "They have dogs." Jake had already considered this problem. "There's a creek about half a mile north of here. We'll wade upstream for a quarter mile, then cut across the rocks to the deer path. Dogs can't follow scent through running water, and the rocks won't hold our tracks." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "You know about tracking. Spent a lot of years in these mountains," Jake said simply. "You learn things." What he didn't say was that he'd learned many of those things during the 3-day search for Anna, following false trails and desperate hopes through terrain that had eventually claimed both their lives. Some knowledge came at too high a price to speak of casually. Jake shouldered his pack and extended his arms toward the baby. Emma hesitated for a long moment, then carefully transferred the child to his care. The baby was burning with fever, his small body limp with exhaustion. Jake tucked him inside his coat, using his own body heat to provide warmth, while ensuring the child could still breathe easily. "His name is Luke," Emma said quietly. "Hello, Luke," Jake murmured to the baby. "We're going to get you somewhere safe and warm." They began their climb toward Eagle's Ridge, moving single file with Jake leading the way. Emma followed close behind, carrying the cloth bag that contained their few possessions. Tommy walked between his older sister and Katie, taking his protective role seriously. Katie brought up the rear, still clutching her doll but keeping pace without complaint. The trail Jake chose was challenging but not impossible, winding through stands of pine and aspen that provided cover from any watchers below. He set a pace that pushed them but didn't exhaust the children, stopping frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow that helped conceal their movement. As they climbed higher, Jake found himself stealing glances at Emma. Despite her exhaustion and fear, she moved with a kind of grace, stepping carefully over roots and rocks while keeping one eye on her children at all times. Her torn wedding dress was completely impractical for mountain hiking, but she'd torn strips from the skirt to wrap around Katie's legs, protecting the little girl from brambles and rough terrain. "How long were you married to him?" Jake asked during one of their rest stops. Emma's face darkened. 3 months. 3 months too long. And the children? My siblings. Our parents died in a mine collapse last spring. Crane held the mortgage on our land, said he'd forgive the debt if I married him. Her voice turned bitter. He failed to mention that the debt would transfer to Tommy, Katie, and Luke if something happened to me. Failed to mention a lot of things. Jake felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to spend 3 days clawing at rocks that wouldn't yield. Crane had trapped this woman as surely as if he'd used steel cables, leveraging her love for her siblings to secure her compliance. It was the kind of calculated cruelty that made Jake wish he believed in hell, just so he could imagine Crane burning in it. "He hurt you," Jake said. It wasn't a question. Emma's hand moved unconsciously to the bruise on her jaw. "He said I needed to learn proper respect for my husband. Said the children needed to learn too, so they'd grow up understanding their place." The rage in Jake's chest grew hotter. "Is that why you ran?" "Partly." Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "But mostly because of what he planned for Katie." Jake's blood turned to ice. Katie was 5 years old, still young enough to believe that monsters only existed in fairy tales. The thought of Crane turning his attention to her made Jake want to turn around and hunt the man down like the animal he was. "He'll never touch her," Jake said, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. "Never touch any of you again." Emma looked at him with surprise, apparently startled by the vehemence in his voice. "You don't even know us." "I know enough," Jake replied. "I know you're brave enough to run into the wilderness with 3 children rather than let him hurt them. I know you're smart enough to find shelter and resourceful enough to keep them alive for 3 days. And I know you love them more than your own safety. That's what mothers do," Emma said simply. "That's what good mothers do," Jake corrected. "Not all mothers are willing to sacrifice everything for their children." They resumed climbing as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Jake could feel the baby's fever through his coat, could hear the increasingly labored quality of his breathing. Luke needed medicine and warmth, and he needed them soon. The cabin was still more than an hour away, assuming they didn't encounter any obstacles or delays. As if summoned by his worry, the distant sound of barking echoed up from the valley below. Crane's dogs had found their trail, despite the precautions they'd taken at the creek. Either Burton was a better tracker than Jake had given him credit for, or they'd left some sign he hadn't anticipated. "How much further?" Emma asked, her voice tight with renewed fear. "Hour, maybe less," Jake replied. "But we need to move faster now." He adjusted his grip on the baby and lengthened his stride, trusting Emma and the children to keep up. Behind them the barking grew closer, more excited. The dogs had definitely found something, whether it was their actual trail or just a fresh scent that had crossed their path. The trail steepened as they approached the final approach to Jake's cabin. winding through a series of switchbacks that would slow their pursuers but also leave them exposed if anyone reached the lower slopes before they gained the ridge. Jake's shoulders burned from carrying the baby, and he could hear Emma's labored breathing behind him, but they couldn't afford to stop now. Tommy stumbled on a loose rock, skinning his knee and crying out in pain. Emma immediately knelt beside him, checking the injury while Katie pressed close, tears streaming down her small face. "I'm okay," Tommy said bravely, though blood was seeping through his torn pants. "I can keep going." Jake knelt beside them, shifting the baby to one arm, while he examined Tommy's knee. The cut wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely, and the boy was clearly in pain despite his brave words. "You're tough as old leather," Jake told him, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "But even tough men take care of their wounds." He bound the cut quickly, tying the cloth tight enough to stop the bleeding but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Tommy watched the process with fascination, clearly impressed by Jake's efficient first aid. "My PA used to do that," Tommy said quietly, "when I got hurt in the mine." "Your PA taught you well about being brave," Jake replied. "But he'd want you to be smart too. There's no shame in admitting when you're hurt." Emma watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. In 3 months of marriage, she'd never seen Crane show the slightest gentleness toward any of them. The contrast between his casual cruelty and Jake's patient kindness was almost overwhelming. They resumed their climb, with Jake now carrying both the baby and Katie, who had finally reached the limits of her 5-year-old endurance. Emma stayed close to Tommy, ready to catch him if he stumbled again. The boy limped slightly but maintained his determined pace, clearly drawing strength from Jake's confidence in his abilities. The sun had nearly touched the western peaks when they finally crested the ridge and saw Jake's cabin nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Emma had expected, built from hand-hewn logs and chinked with careful precision. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, indicating that Jake had banked the fire before leaving that morning. Windows glowed with the warm yellow light of oil lamps, making the entire structure look like something from a fairy tale. "Home," Jake said simply, the word carrying a weight of meaning that made Emma's throat tighten. For 3 months she'd lived in Crane's mansion, surrounded by luxury that felt like a beautiful prison. Before that, her family's cabin had been small and humble but filled with love and laughter. This place felt different from both might this solid and permanent, built by hands that understood the value of craftsmanship, but somehow lonely despite its obvious comfort. Jake set Katie down gently and handed the baby back to Emma before approaching the cabin door. He produced a key from his pocket, then paused and looked back at them. "Once you cross this threshold, you're under my protection," he said formally. "That means Crane and his men will have to go through me to reach you. Are you certain this is what you want?" Emma looked at her 3 siblings, at Tommy trying not to favor his injured leg, at Katie swaying with exhaustion, at baby Luke burning with fever in her arms. She thought of Crane's hands on her body, his threats against the children, his plans for Katie that had finally driven her to desperate flight. "Yes," she said firmly. "Whatever the cost, yes." Jake nodded and opened the door, stepping aside to let them enter first. Emma walked across the threshold carrying Luke, with Tommy and Katie close behind her. As she stepped into the warm lamp-lit interior, she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the possibility of hope. Behind them the mountain wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of dogs and shouting men. Crane's hunters were getting closer, but for the first time in 3 days, Emma Walsh was not running. She was taking a stand, placing her trust in a man she'd known for less than a day, betting everything on the quiet strength she'd seen in his weathered face. The door closed behind them with a solid thunk, and Jake threw the heavy wooden bar that secured it. Whatever came next, they would face it together, in this place where mountain solitude had preserved one man's capacity for protection, even when he'd forgotten how to hope. Part 2. The Shelter of Strangers. The interior of Jake's cabin revealed the careful attention of a man who had made peace with solitude. Hand-carved furniture filled the space with purposeful efficiency, every piece built to last generations. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth large enough to warm the entire single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A ladder led to a loft overhead, while a separate door suggested additional rooms beyond the main living area. Emma stepped further inside, still clutching Luke against her chest. The baby's breathing had grown more labored during their climb, and his small body trembled with fever despite the warmth of Jake's coat. Katie immediately gravitated toward the fireplace, drawn by its promise of heat after 3 cold nights in the wilderness. Tommy remained close to Emma, his protective instincts keeping him alert despite his obvious exhaustion. "There's a bedroom through that door," Jake said, gesturing toward the back of the cabin. "Clean bed, warm quilts. The baby needs to be kept warm while his fever breaks." Emma hesitated. The bedroom represented privacy, vulnerability. In Crane's house, closed doors had meant danger, isolation from help but Luke's rattling cough decided for her. Whatever her fears, her brother's need was greater. The bedroom was smaller than the main room but no less carefully appointed. A large bed dominated the space, covered with quilts that appeared hand-stitched in intricate patterns. A washstand sat beneath a mirror, while a wardrobe suggested storage for clothes. Most importantly, a small pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated gentle heat throughout the room. "Anna made those quilts," Jake said quietly from the doorway. "She always said a home wasn't complete without something beautiful and useful." Emma looked up from settling Luke on the bed. "Anna, my fiancée. She died 8 years ago." Jake's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to speak of grief without drowning in it. This was going to be our room. The revelation hung between them, heavy with implication. Emma was putting her sick brother in the bed. Jake had prepared for his bride, wrapping him in quilts stitched by hands that would never finish their work. The intimacy of it felt almost overwhelming. "I can make up somewhere else," Emma began, but Jake cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "Anna would want them used for someone who needed them," he said simply. "She always believed beautiful things should serve their purpose, not sit empty because of sentiment." Emma settled Luke more carefully among the quilts, noting their incredible softness and the precision of their stitching. Each one told a story in fabric and thread, depicting scenes of mountain life with extraordinary detail. One showed a cabin much like this one, surrounded by pine trees heavy with snow. Another featured a garden in full bloom, with vegetables and flowers growing in careful rows. A third depicted 2 figures standing on a mountain peak, hands clasped as they looked out over an endless vista. "She was talented," Emma said softly. "She was everything good about life," Jake replied. "Everything I was too stupid to protect." Before Emma could respond to this harsh self-judgment, Tommy tugged at her skirt. "Emma, I'm really hungry." And Katie's crying again. Indeed, Katie had collapsed near the fireplace, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the delayed shock of their ordeal. Her quiet sobs filled the cabin with heartbreak, the sound of a child who had been brave far too long. Jake moved immediately toward the kitchen area, his hands already reaching for supplies. When did they last eat a proper meal? Emma tried to remember. Time had become fluid during their flight, measured in distance covered and dangers avoided rather than normal rhythms of day and night. 3 days ago, maybe 4, we had bread from the kitchen before we left, but it ran out yesterday. Jake's jaw tightened with controlled anger. Growing children shouldn't go 4 days without food. I know that, Emma snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. Fear and exhaustion had frayed her nerves. But Jake didn't deserve her anger. I'm sorry. I did the best I could. I know you did. Jake said gently. I wasn't criticizing you. I was thinking about what I'd like to do to Crane for putting you all in this situation. He pulled ingredients from shelves and cold storage with practiced efficiency. Soon the cabin filled with the aroma of bacon frying and coffee brewing. Emma watched him work, surprised by his domestic competence. Most men she'd known left such tasks to their wives or daughters, considering cooking beneath their dignity. You're handy in a kitchen, she observed. Jake shrugged. 8 years of cooking for myself. You learn or you starve. He prepared a simple but nourishing meal. Bacon, eggs, biscuits fresh from the oven, and coffee strong enough to revive the dead. For the children he heated milk with honey, creating a sweet drink that would provide energy without upsetting empty stomachs. For Luke he brewed willow bark tea, straining it carefully and adding honey to mask the bitter taste. Emma tried to feed the tea to her brother, but Luke was too weak to swallow properly. Most of the liquid dribbled down his chin, and his breathing grew more distressed with each failed attempt. Let me try, Jake
Offered, settling beside them on the bed. His large hands were surprisingly gentle as he supported Luke's head, tilting it at just the right angle to make swallowing easier. Come on, little man. This will help with the fever. Something in Jake's voice seemed to reach the baby. Luke's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on the bearded face above him. For a moment he studied Jake with the serious attention that only very young children could manage. Then, without warning, he smiled. Emma's breath caught. Luke hadn't smiled since they'd begun running. She'd begun to fear that Crane's cruelty had stolen even that simple joy from her baby brother. There we go, Jake murmured, successfully getting Luke to swallow a small amount of tea. That's better. You just needed someone who knew the trick. In the main room, Tommy and Katie fell upon their meal with the desperate hunger of children who had learned not to take food for granted. Katie ate with methodical determination, as if storing up against future famine. Tommy tried to maintain dignity while consuming everything in sight, clearly torn between good manners and genuine starvation. Jake prepared a plate for Emma and carried it to the bedroom, along with her own cup of coffee. She accepted it gratefully, only then realizing how much her own hunger had been masked by worry and adrenaline. How long can we stay here? She asked between bites. As long as necessary, Jake replied. Crane's men don't know about this place. Even if they did, the trail up here is defensible. One man with a rifle could hold off a dozen attackers. Emma set down her fork. You can't fight Crane's entire organization by yourself. I don't intend to fight them, Jake said. I intend to make sure they never find you. And if they do? Jake's expression grew distant, and Emma glimpsed something cold and implacable in his weathered features. Then they'll discover that 8 years of solitude haven't made me soft. The certainty in his voice was both comforting and terrifying. Emma had no doubt that Jake Mitchell could be dangerous when circumstances demanded it. The question was whether even his mountain-honed skills would be enough against Crane's resources and connections. As if reading her thoughts, Jake continued, Crane rules through fear and money. Up here, neither of those things matter much. The mountain doesn't care about his political connections, and his hired thugs are city men who don't know granite from limestone. What about the law? He has Sheriff Mason in his pocket. Sheriff Mason's jurisdiction ends at the town line, Jake said grimly, and I've never cared much for corrupt lawmen anyway. Over the next hour, Jake proved his domestic competence extended beyond cooking. He produced clothes from the wardrobe, explaining that he'd purchased them years ago with the intention of eventually having guests. The women's clothes had been meant for Anna, but Jake insisted that practical need outweighed sentimental attachment. Emma found herself in a simple but well-made dress of blue wool, warm and comfortable after days in her torn wedding gown. Katie was swimming in one of Anna's nightgowns, but she declared it the most beautiful thing she'd ever worn. Tommy received a set of men's clothes cut down to fit, making him feel grown up and important. You look like a proper mountain family now, Jake observed, and something in his tone made Emma glance at him sharply. We're not a family, she said carefully. We're refugees you've been kind enough to help. Jake's expression was unreadable. Of course, I only meant you looked like you belonged here. But Emma sensed deeper currents in his words, undercurrents that both attracted and frightened her. She had fled one man's attempt to possess her only to find herself dependent on another's protection. The circumstances were entirely different, but the fundamental vulnerability remained the same. As evening settled over the mountain, Jake prepared sleeping arrangements with the same methodical care he'd shown for everything else. Tommy would sleep in the loft, which the boy declared the finest room he'd ever seen. Katie would share the main bed with Emma and Luke, while Jake insisted he was perfectly comfortable in his chair by the fire. I've slept in worse places, he assured Emma when she protested this arrangement. Besides, someone should keep watch tonight. Crane's men might try a night approach. Emma wanted to argue, but exhaustion was finally overwhelming her adrenaline. Luke's fever had broken slightly thanks to the willow bark tea and warmth, and his breathing had eased enough for sleep. Katie had already fallen asleep in her borrowed nightgown, one arm wrapped around her cloth doll. Tommy had tried to stay awake in his exciting new loft, but had succumbed within minutes of lying down. Jake, Emma said, as she prepared for bed. Why are you doing this? Really? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too low to hear. 8 years ago, I failed to save someone I loved. Maybe this is my chance to prove I'm not completely useless when people need help. Anna's death wasn't your fault. Jake's laugh was harsh. I was the one who insisted on climbing Devil's Peak in bad weather. I was the one who tied the rope that snapped. I was the one who couldn't reach her in time. He stared into the fire, his profile etched with old pain. Everything that happened was because of my choices. Emma wanted to say something comforting, but she recognized the futility of arguing with guilt that had had 8 years to calcify into unshakable conviction. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for saving us." "Don't thank me yet," Jake replied. "We're not safe until Crane gives up, or we find a permanent solution." Emma settled into the bed beside her sleeping siblings, pulling Anna's quilts around them like a protective barrier. The bed was more comfortable than anything she'd experienced in months, and the warmth radiating from the nearby stove made her feel safer than she had since her parents' death. But sleep remained elusive, her mind racing through the day's events and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Through the open bedroom door, she could see Jake sitting motionless in his chair, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the cabin's windows. Even in rest, he radiated watchful tension, like a predator prepared to defend its territory. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead it reminded Emma of how completely her fate now depended on this enigmatic stranger. What did she really know about Jake Mitchell? That he had loved a woman named Anna and blamed himself for her death. That he possessed domestic skills and wilderness knowledge in equal measure. That he had chosen to help them despite obvious personal cost. But beyond these surface facts, he remained a mystery, shaped by 8 years of isolation and loss in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Emma found herself wondering what kind of man Jake had been before grief transformed him into the mountain hermit of local legend. Had he laughed easily? Had he been quick to anger or slow to trust? Most importantly, what did he really want from them in return for his protection? In her experience, men always wanted something. Part 3. Bonds forged in mountain solitude. Dawn came slowly to Eagle's Ridge, filtered through pine boughs heavy with morning dew. Emma woke to the sound of Luke's improved breathing and the aroma of fresh coffee and frying bacon. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the novel experience of waking without immediate fear, without the need to grab the children and run. Jake had clearly been awake for hours. Through the bedroom door, she could see him moving efficiently around the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be a substantial breakfast. He'd changed from his previous day's clothes into fresh garments, and his hair showed signs of recent washing. The transformation from yesterday's trail-worn rescuer to this morning's competent host was remarkable. Luke stirred against her side, His fever significantly reduced, though not entirely broken. His eyes opened with more alertness than he'd shown in days, and when he saw Emma's face, he managed a weak smile that nearly brought tears to her eyes. "How are you feeling, little one?" she whispered. Luke's response was a soft babble that might have contained actual words. He was only 2 years old, just beginning to develop real language when their parents had died, and their world had collapsed into survival and fear. Emma wondered how much of his development had been stunted by the trauma of recent months. Katie woke next, stretching luxuriously in the warm bed. "Emma, I dreamed we were in a castle, and there was a nice giant who protected us from dragons." "Not a giant," Emma corrected gently. "A mountain man." "Same thing," Katie said with the absolute conviction of childhood logic. Tommy called down from the loft, his voice bright with excitement. "Emma, you have to see the view from up here. You can see the whole world." Jake appeared in the bedroom doorway, coffee cup in hand. "Good morning. How's our patient?" Emma sat up, suddenly conscious of her disheveled hair and borrowed clothes. "Much better." The tea helped tremendously. "Willow bark is nature's medicine," Jake said. "My mother used it when I was Tommy's age. Some knowledge gets passed down because it works." He approached the bed with easy confidence, placing a gentle hand on Luke's forehead. "Fever's down, but not gone. Another day of rest and medicine should do it." The casual intimacy of his touch, the way he included himself in Luke's care without presumption, struck Emma as both wonderful and dangerous. In her experience, men who took interest in children's welfare usually had ulterior motives. "I can manage his care," she said. Perhaps more sharply than necessary. Jake's hand withdrew immediately. "Of course, I only meant to help." Emma immediately regretted her tone. "I'm sorry, it's just that I'm used to being responsible for them alone." "I understand," Jake said, though his expression suggested her words had stung. "I'll have breakfast ready when you're ready to eat." Over the morning meal, a routine began to establish itself. Jake proved to have an intuitive understanding of children's needs, cutting Tommy's bacon into manageable pieces and diluting Katie's coffee with plenty of milk and sugar. He listened seriously to Tommy's questions about mountain wildlife and treated Katie's rambling stories about her doll with grave attention. Most remarkably, he seemed to genuinely enjoy their company. Emma had grown accustomed to men who tolerated children as necessary burdens, obstacles to adult conversation and comfort. Jake, by contrast, appeared energized by their presence, as if their chatter and questions awakened something in him that had been dormant too long. "Can we explore outside today?" Tommy asked hopefully. "I want to see everything." "We need to be careful," Emma said quickly. "Crane's men might still be searching." Jake considered this. "The immediate area around the cabin is safe. I've got warning systems set up on all the approaches. We'd know if anyone was coming long before they could see us." "Warning systems, tripwires connected to bells. Old trapper's trick. Plus I know every sound these woods make naturally. Anything out of place stands out like a wolf howl in a library." After breakfast, Jake proved his point by taking them on a careful tour of his property. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by defensive positions that spoke of both paranoia and practical wisdom. He'd built the structure with its back against a sheer rock face, eliminating any possibility of rear attack. The front commanded a view of the only feasible approach route, while the sides were protected by tangles of deadfall that would slow any attacker to a crawl. "You've built a fortress," Emma observed. "I've built a home that's hard to attack," Jake corrected. "There's a difference." The difference became clear as the tour continued. This wasn't the paranoid bunker of a madman, but the careful preparation of someone who understood that safety sometimes required vigilance. Jake had created a place where he could live in peace while remaining ready for trouble. The warning systems he'd mentioned proved to be ingeniously simple. Thin wires stretched between trees at ankle height, invisible unless you knew where to look. Anyone stumbling over them would trigger bells hidden in various locations, creating an early warning network that covered every possible approach. "How long did this take to set up?" Emma asked. 8 years, Jake admitted. I added something every season, started with just the cabin and basic defenses. Kept improving as I learned more about what worked. Tommy was fascinated by the mechanical aspects of the system. Can you teach me how it works? If your sister says it's all right, Jake replied, glancing at Emma for permission. Emma found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. Tommy needed positive male influence, needed to learn skills that would serve him as he grew older. Jake seemed willing to provide that guidance without the domineering cruelty she'd witnessed in other men. The day passed in a blur of new experiences for the children. Jake taught Tommy how to identify different tree species and animal tracks. He showed Katie the small garden where he grew vegetables during the brief mountain summer. He even convinced Luke to drink more willow bark tea by making a game of it, complete with silly faces and encouraging sounds. For Emma, watching these interactions was both heartwarming and terrifying. The children were bonding with Jake in ways that could prove devastating if circumstances forced them to leave. But she couldn't deny that his influence was entirely positive. Tommy stood straighter and spoke with more confidence after spending the morning learning man's skills. Katie laughed more than she had since their parents' death. Even Luke seemed to respond to Jake's deep voice and gentle handling. That evening, as they gathered around the fireplace after another substantial meal, Jake began telling stories. Not fairy tales or children's fantasies, but real accounts of mountain life, adventures he'd experienced during his years of isolation. He spoke of tracking wounded bears through blizzards, of finding hidden caves filled with ancient Indian paintings, of nights when the aurora borealis painted the sky in impossible colors. Tommy and Katie listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide with wonder. Even Luke seemed mesmerized by the sound of Jake's voice, his small body relaxed and content in ways Emma hadn't seen in months. Are you really all alone up here? Katie asked during a pause in the storytelling. Most of the time, Jake admitted. Sometimes I go weeks without seeing another person. Don't you get lonely? Jake's eyes flicked to Emma before returning to Katie. I used to think I preferred being alone, but having company again reminds me what I've been missing. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding that Jake's answer was directed as much at her as at Katie. Why don't you live in town with other people? Tommy asked with childhood's direct curiosity. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Sometimes when something terrible happens, it feels easier to stay away from people who might get hurt. Mountains don't break your heart or disappoint you. They're honest about what they are. People can be honest too, Katie said with 5-year-old wisdom. Emma always tells the truth, even when it's scary. Jake's gaze met Emma's across the firelight. Some people are honest, those are the ones worth knowing. Later, after the children were settled for sleep, Emma and Jake found themselves alone by the dying fire. The intimacy of the setting, combined with the day's growing sense of domestic harmony, created an atmosphere charged with possibility and danger. The children adore you, Emma said carefully. They're good kids. They deserve better than what they've been through. What happens when Crane gives up searching? We can't stay here forever. Jake poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Why can't you? The question hit Emma like a physical blow. Because this isn't our home. Because you didn't sign up for a permanent house full of refugees. Because I won't make the mistake of depending on a man's protection again. What if the man wanted to be depended on? Emma's breath caught. Jake, we barely know each other. I know you're brave and intelligent and fierce when protecting your family. I know you make excellent coffee and your laugh sounds like music. I know you've been hurt by men who didn't deserve you, and I know you're afraid to trust again. His honesty was devastating in its completeness. What do you know about what I need? I know you need someone who'll put your family's safety above his own convenience. Someone who'll treat your siblings like they matter, not like burdens to be tolerated. Someone who understands that love means protecting what's precious, not possessing it. Emma stared at him, overwhelmed by the depth of understanding in his words. And you think you're that someone? I think I'd like the chance to prove it. The conversation was interrupted by Luke's crying from the bedroom. Emma rose quickly, grateful for the excuse to escape the intensity of Jake's attention. But as she comforted her baby brother back to sleep, she found herself thinking about Jake's words, about the possibility of a life built on mutual respect rather than fear and obligation. The thought was more terrifying than Crane's pursuit had ever been. Part 4: Shadows of the Past. The fourth morning of their stay brought unwelcome visitors to Eagle's Ridge. Emma woke to the sound of Jake moving through the cabin with urgent but controlled haste, checking his rifle and peering through windows with the focused attention of a predator scenting danger. "What is it?" she whispered, gathering Luke close while Tommy and Katie stirred around her. "Riders coming up the valley. 3 of them, maybe 4. Too far to see clearly, but they're not casual travelers." Emma's blood turned to ice. "Crane's men, likely." Jake's voice was calm, but his hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared for potential conflict. "Get the children dressed and ready to move quickly if necessary. But stay calm, they might just be scouting, trying to flush us out with pressure rather than force." Emma dressed Luke with trembling fingers while Tommy and Katie, sensing the tension, remained unusually quiet. Through the bedroom window she could make out distant figures on horseback, moving slowly up the mountain trail that led toward Jake's hidden cabin. They rode with the methodical patience of hunters following a cold scent. Jake had positioned himself at the main window, rifle ready but not obviously visible to anyone outside. His entire demeanor had changed from the gentle storyteller of the previous evening to something harder and more dangerous. This was the man who had survived 8 years alone in wilderness that claimed lives every winter. The man who had tracked Anna's killers to their deaths in the avalanche that followed her fall. How close will they get before the warning system alerts them? Emma asked. Depends on how good their tracker is. The bells are positioned to give us 10 minutes warning if they find the main trail. Less if they're smart enough to come cross-country. As if summoned by his words, a distant chiming reached their ears, faint but unmistakable. Someone had triggered the first perimeter wire, still nearly a mile from the cabin but definitely on the correct path. "They found it," Jake said grimly. "Either they're very good or very lucky. What do we do?" Jake's expression was thoughtful rather than panicked. "We find out what they want and how far they're willing to go to get it. Stay in the bedroom with the children. If shooting starts, there's a root cellar entrance behind the wardrobe. Pull it aside and get them down there." Emma's mouth went dry. "What about you?" "I'll handle whatever needs handling." Before Emma could protest this casual dismissal of his own safety, another bell chimed, closer this time. The riders were making good time despite the difficult terrain. Whoever led them knew mountain travel and wasn't intimidated by Jake's defensive preparations. Jake moved to a different window, studying the approaching threat with professional interest. 4 riders, well-mounted and well-armed. The leaders got military bearing. This isn't some collection of town thugs Crane threw together. Professional hired guns, worse, that looks like Burton himself leading them. Crane's personal enforcer. The man who handles problems that require permanent solutions. Emma had heard stories about Burton even before her forced marriage to Crane. A former cavalry sergeant who'd left the army under mysterious circumstances, he'd built a reputation throughout the territory for solving problems with bullets when legal methods proved insufficient. If Crane had sent Burton personally, it meant he considered the Walsh children worth killing for. The third bell chimed, and Jake's expression hardened. "They'll be visible from here in 5 minutes. Get the children ready to move, but don't go to the cellar yet. We might still be able to resolve this without violence." Emma herded Tommy and Katie into the bedroom, explaining in whispered tones that they needed to be very quiet and ready to hide if necessary. Tommy's face went pale but determined, while Katie clutched her doll with white knuckles. Luke remained mercifully quiet, his fever finally broken enough to allow peaceful sleep. Through the bedroom window, Emma caught her first glimpse of the approaching riders. Burton was exactly as she'd imagined him, tall, lean, and radiating cold competence. His three companions were cut from the same cloth, professional killers who would follow orders without question or conscience. They stopped at the edge of Jake's clearing, just outside comfortable rifle range but close enough to make their presence unmistakable. Burton dismounted and stepped forward several paces, his hands visible and empty. "Jake Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Jake remained at his window, rifle trained on Burton's chest. "Nothing to talk about, Burton. You're trespassing on my land. I'm here on official business. Vincent Crane has legal custody of 3 minor children who were kidnapped from his home. I'm here to collect them and bring them back where they belong." "The only thing that belongs to Vincent Crane is a shallow grave," Jake replied calmly. "But I'm not particular about when he claims it." Burton's laugh was without humor. "Brave words from a man hiding behind log walls. We both know you can't stay in there forever." "Don't need to stay forever, just need to stay longer than you can afford to camp out here waiting." Emma could hear the calculation in both men's voices, the careful weighing of options and risks that preceded violence. Burton was trying to determine Jake's resolve and resources. Jake was buying time while assessing the tactical situation. Cranes offered $1,000 for their safe return. Burton continued, "No questions asked, no charges filed. You could take that money and disappear, start fresh somewhere far from here." "What's his offer for their bodies?" The question hung in the air like a physical challenge. Burton's response confirmed Emma's worst fears about Crane's intentions. "Same price either way. Crane's not particular about condition, just wants his property back." Jake's voice went deadly quiet. "Those children aren't property. And the only thing Crane's going to get back is whatever pieces of you I decide to send him." Burton stepped closer, testing Jake's resolve. "You're outnumbered 4-1, Mitchell. Even if you're good enough to take 1 or 2 of us, the others will finish you and burn that cabin around whoever's left inside." "Maybe. But you'll be the first to die, Burton. I guarantee that much." The standoff stretched for long minutes, both sides evaluating options and preparing for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. Emma found herself holding her breath, waiting for the first shot that would transform their temporary sanctuary into a battlefield. Instead, an unexpected sound broke the tension, the distant howl of wolves echoing across the valley below. Burton's men looked around nervously, apparently unfamiliar with the normal sounds of mountain wilderness. Even Burton seemed momentarily distracted by the wild music. Jake's voice carried a note of grim amusement. "You hear that, Burton? That's the mountain telling you to leave. Wolves don't howl in broad daylight unless something's got them spooked. Something big enough to make them nervous. Wolves don't worry me. They should. Pack that size can bring down a horse in minutes. Strip a man to bones before his screams stop echoing." Burton's response was cut off by another sound, closer and more immediate, the crack of a rifle shot from somewhere above and behind the cabin. All 4 riders spun toward the sound, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced speed. Jake's expression showed surprise but not alarm. "Seems like you boys have attracted some unwelcome attention." From their elevated position on the ridge above Burton's men, a voice called down with calm authority. "Burton, you and your men are surrounded. Drop your weapons and ride out, or we'll drop you where you stand." Emma recognized the voice. Doc Harrison, Jake's only regular contact with the outside world. But how had he known to come here? And who was with him? Burton's tactical situation had just become untenable. Caught between Jake's rifle and unknown numbers of shooters on the high ground, his men were exposed and vulnerable. Professional killers or not, they understood when odds had shifted beyond acceptable risk. "This isn't over, Mitchell," Burton called out, but his voice carried the frustration of a man whose carefully planned operation had just collapsed around him. "Yes, it is," Jake replied. "Take your men and ride out. If I see any of you on my mountain again, I'll assume you came here to die." Burton and his men mounted their horses and rode away, their retreat swift but not panicked. Emma watched them disappear into the forest, knowing they would return with greater numbers and better preparation. Within minutes, Doc Harrison appeared at the cabin door, accompanied by two men Emma didn't recognize. Both carried rifles and moved with the easy confidence of experienced hunters. "Thought you might need some backup," Doc said as Jake opened the door. "Word reached town about Burton asking questions, and I figured it was connected to your situation." Jake clasped the older man's shoulder gratefully. "How did you know they'd found this place?" "Been watching for them since yesterday. Sam here spotted their tracks on the lower trail and sent word up to Pete's place. We've been following them since dawn." The two strangers introduced themselves as Sam Crawford and Pete Morrison, local hunters who had no love for Crane's methods or Burton's brutality. Their intervention had been entirely voluntary, motivated by mountain community code that stood by neighbors against outside threats. "Crane's escalating," Doc warned. "Burton coming here personally means he's desperate to get those children back. Desperate enough to risk open warfare against local people." Emma emerged from the bedroom, carrying Luke while Tommy and Katie stayed close behind her. The sight of armed men in Jake's cabin, even friendly ones, reminded her forcefully that their sanctuary was temporary and increasingly fragile. "How long before they come back?" she asked. "Day or two," Sam answered. "Time for Burton to get reinforcements and plan a proper assault. This was just reconnaissance, testing defenses and resolve." Pete nodded agreement. "Crane's got enough money to hire an army if he wants. Question is whether he's willing to risk that much attention from territorial authorities." Jake's expression was thoughtful. "He might be. Whatever his interest in those children, it's worth considerable risk and expense." Emma felt the weight of everyone's attention settling on her. These men were risking their lives for her family, and they deserved to know why Crane was so determined to reclaim them. "It's not just about us," she said quietly. "Crane has plans that require controlling our property and our silence. If we escape permanently, we can expose things that would destroy his business and political connections." "What kind of things?" Doc asked gently. Emma took a deep breath, knowing that sharing this information would make all of them targets. Mining claims obtained through fraud. Murders disguised as accidents. Political bribes documented in his private ledgers. "I saw the records during our marriage, copied what I could."
Before we ran, the revelation hung in the air like smoke from a brush fire. Everyone present understood that they had just learned information worth killing for, information that made them accessories to whatever Crane considered treason against his empire. "Where are these copies?" Jake asked. Emma patted the cloth bag she'd carried throughout their flight. "Sewn into Luke's diaper padding. The last place anyone would think to look." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The evidence that could bring down one of the territory's most powerful men was hidden in a baby's clothing, protected by an infant's innocent presence. "That changes everything," Doc said grimly. "Crane can't afford to let you live now, children or no children." Jake's expression had hardened into something implacable. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to try." Part 5. The choice between safety and justice. The revelation about the hidden documents transformed the atmosphere in Jake's cabin from tense refuge to war council. Doc Harrison spread a territorial map across the table while Sam and Pete discussed defensive positions and escape routes. Everyone understood that Burton's retreat was merely a pause before greater violence.
Emma sat in the corner nursing Luke while Tommy and Katie played quietly with wooden toys Jake had carved during his years of solitude. The normalcy of the children's games contrasted sharply with the adult conversation about kill zones and ammunition supplies. How had her attempt to protect her siblings led to this expanding circle of danger? The territorial marshal's office is in Denver. Doc said, pointing to the map. If we could get those documents to them, Crane's entire operation would collapse. But it's 300 miles of dangerous travel, and Crane has people watching every major trail. What about going north into Montana? Pete suggested. Federal authorities there might be interested in territorial corruption. Jake shook his head. Too far and winter's coming. Part 3. The weight of trust. Jake studied the map with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. His finger traced various routes while his mind calculated distances, risks, and seasonal challenges. Emma watched him work, struck by the transformation from isolated hermit to tactical commander. 8 years of solitude had not dulled his strategic mind. There's another option, Jake said slowly. We don't run. We make our stand here and force Crane to come to us on ground of our choosing. Doc Harrison looked up sharply. Jake, that's suicide. Even with help, we can't hold this position against unlimited numbers. We don't need to hold forever. Just long enough for word to reach the right people. Crane's power depends on operating in shadows. Shine enough light on his methods and his political protection disappears. Sam Crawford shifted uncomfortably. That's assuming anyone in authority cares about justice over profit. Crane's got fingers in every pie from here to the Capitol. Not every pie. Pete Morrison interjected. Federal marshals answer to Washington, not local politicians. And there's talk of statehood coming. Congress won't want territorial scandals complicating the process. Emma listened to this exchange with growing unease. These men were discussing her family's fate as if it were a chess problem to be solved rather than human lives hanging in the balance. She understood their good intentions, but their focus on grand strategies overlooked the immediate reality of 3 children who needed safety, not justice. What about Emma and the children? She asked, her voice cutting through the tactical discussion. While you're planning this righteous crusade, who's protecting them from Burton's next visit? Jake's attention turned to her immediately. They're the reason we're planning. Everything we do is about keeping them safe. Safe by making this cabin a target for every gun Crane can hire. Safe by turning them into bait for a trap that might not work. Emma's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. These are children, not pawns in your war against Crane. The accusation hit home. Jake's expression showed the sting of her words, the suggestion that he was using them for his own purposes. Doc and the others looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing the validity of her concerns. What would you have us do? Jake asked quietly. Run forever. Hope Crane eventually loses interest. Pray that Burton decides 3 children aren't worth the effort. Emma stood, still holding Luke, her entire body radiating protective fury. I'd have you remember that this isn't your fight. You didn't ask for this responsibility, and you can walk away any time you choose. But these children can't walk away from being my siblings. They can't stop being targets because we're tired of running. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy and Katie had stopped playing, sensing the adult tension that filled the cabin like smoke. Even Luke seemed to respond to his sister's distress, making small fussing sounds that spoke of environmental anxiety. Jake stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. You're right. This isn't my fight by birth or obligation. But I've made it my fight by choice. And I won't apologize for wanting to end Crane's threat permanently rather than postponing it indefinitely. Your choice could get them killed. Running could get them killed too. At least this way, we control some of the variables. Emma turned away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. Through the window she could see the mountain peaks that surrounded them, beautiful and implacable. Jake had chosen this fortress of solitude after losing Anna, and now he was asking her to trust it with the lives of everyone she loved. I need air, she said abruptly, heading for the door. Jake moved to follow, but Doc caught his arm. Let her go. She needs time to process this. Outside, Emma walked to the edge of the clearing, still carrying Luke. The mountain air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of early snow. In the distance she could hear the sound of water running over rocks, a creek that probably fed into the same valley where Burton's men had appeared that morning. How had her life become this series of impossible choices? 6 months ago, her biggest concern had been stretching their food budget until the next mining pay. Now she was weighing the lives of strangers against the safety of her siblings, trying to decide whether to trust a man she barely knew with everything that mattered to her. Luke stirred in her arms, his small hand grasping at her hair. His fever was completely gone now, thanks to Jake's care and medicine. In 3 days, this mountain hermit had done more for her baby brother than she'd been able to accomplish in 3 months of desperate worry. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it highlighted her own inadequacy. "You're scared," a voice said behind her. Emma turned to find Tommy approaching, his 7-year-old face serious with the gravity of someone trying to understand adult complexities. "I'm not scared," she said, automatically, then caught herself. "Yes, I am scared. Very scared. Of the bad men coming back. Of making the wrong choice. Of trusting the wrong person. Of getting people hurt because I don't know what I'm doing." Tommy considered this with the philosophical acceptance that children often brought to adult fears. "Jake won't let the bad men hurt us." "How can you be so sure?" "Because he looks at us the way Papa used to look at us. Like we're important. Like we matter more than anything else." The simple observation hit Emma like a physical blow. Tommy was right about Jake's expression when he looked at them. The protective intensity that reminded her powerfully of their father's love. But their father had died trying to protect them, crushed by falling rocks in a mine that Crane's negligence had made unsafe. "Sometimes good people can't protect everyone they love," Emma said gently. "Then we help them try." Before Emma could respond to this display of childish wisdom, footsteps approached across the clearing. Jake emerged from the cabin, moving with the careful respect of someone approaching a spooked animal. "The others are gone," he said. "Doc took Sam and Pete back to town to spread word about what's happening here. They'll make sure people know the truth about Crane's methods." Emma nodded without turning around. "And then what?" "Then we wait and see how far Crane is willing to go. How much attention he's willing to risk. You're gambling with their lives." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I gambled with Anna's life too. Convinced her to climb Devil's Peak because I thought I knew better than the weather warnings. Thought my skill and experience were enough to overcome any risk." Emma finally turned to face him. "This is different, is it? I'm asking you to trust my judgment about danger and safety. I'm asking you to believe that my mountain skills are enough to protect you. I'm asking you to bet everything on my ability to keep you safe." The parallel he was drawing was devastatingly clear. Jake saw Emma's situation as a chance to redeem his failure with Anna, to prove that his protection could actually save the people he cared about. But Emma saw it as potentially repeating his greatest mistake, letting confidence override caution until tragedy became inevitable. "What if you're wrong again?" she asked softly. "Then I'll die trying to make it right. But at least this time, I won't be dying alone in a world where nothing matters." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Jake had been living like a dead man for 8 years, going through the motions of survival without any real reason to continue. Her family had given him purpose again, had awakened feelings he'd thought permanently buried. "I won't let you use us as your path to redemption," Emma said firmly. "If you want to die gloriously fighting Crane, that's your choice. But don't drag my siblings into your need to prove yourself." Jake's expression hardened. "That's not what this is about, isn't it? You said yourself that you failed Anna. Now you have a chance to play hero again, to rescue the helpless and defeat the villain. It's a beautiful story, but stories have a way of ending badly for the people who aren't the main character." The accusation clearly stung. Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment Emma thought he might argue. Instead he simply nodded. "You may be right about my motives. I've been alone so long that I might not understand them myself. But regardless of why I want to help you, the fact remains that you need help. And right now, I'm the best option you have." Emma wanted to deny this harsh assessment, but honesty compelled her to acknowledge its truth. Without Jake's intervention, they would have been captured or killed days ago. Without his mountain stronghold, they would still be running through wilderness that grew more dangerous with each passing hour. Whatever his personal motivations, Jake Mitchell had proven himself capable of protecting them when no one else could or would. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "That we make Crane come to us here, where we have every advantage. Force him to bring enough men to ensure outside attention. Use his desperation against him while getting your evidence to people who can act on it. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have time to implement contingency plans, hidden escape routes, supply caches, alternative destinations. But we'll face whatever comes as a family, not as isolated refugees." The word family struck Emma like lightning. Jake was offering more than temporary protection. He was suggesting permanent connection, a place in his life that went beyond obligation or charity. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "Jake," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know what you're going to say, that we barely know each other. That gratitude isn't love. That desperate circumstances make poor foundations for lasting relationships." He paused, his weathered face showing vulnerability that 8 years of isolation hadn't completely hidden. "But I also know that I'd rather face uncertain danger with you than certain emptiness without you." Emma felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking for the chance to find out what we could be together. I'm asking you to trust me with your family's safety and your own heart. I'm asking you to believe that some things are worth fighting for." Tommy, who had been listening to this exchange with the intense attention children brought to important adult conversations, suddenly spoke up. "Are you going to marry Emma?" The question hit both adults like cold water. Emma felt heat flood her cheeks while Jake looked equally stunned by the boy's directness. "Tommy, that's not appropriate," Emma said quickly. "Why not? You like him, and he likes us. Papa said that's how families start, with people choosing to take care of each other." From the mouths of babes. Tommy's simple logic cut through all the complex emotional barriers that adults constructed around such decisions. In his world, people who cared for each other naturally formed families regardless of conventional timelines or social expectations. "Marriage is a big decision," Emma said carefully. "People need time to know each other properly before making such commitments." "How much time?" Tommy asked with childhood's impatience for adult delay. Jake knelt to bring himself to Tommy's eye level, his expression serious. "Your sister is right about taking time, but I want you to know that I care about all of you very much. Whatever happens with Crane, whatever decisions your sister makes about the future, you'll always have a place with me if you want it." Tommy studied Jake's face with the intensity of someone evaluating sincerity. "Promise. Promise." The simple exchange seemed to settle something in the boy's mind. He nodded once, then returned to the cabin, apparently satisfied that the important matters had been addressed. Emma and Jake remained alone in the clearing, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with the mountain breeze. "You're good with him," Emma said finally. "I remember being his age. Remember what it felt like to need reassurance from adults who seemed to understand the world better than I did." "Did they understand the world better?" Jake's smile was rueful. "I thought they did. Took me years to realize that everyone's just making it up as they go along, hoping their choices turn out better than their fears." Emma found herself smiling despite the gravity of their situation. "That's either very wise or very depressing. Can't it be both?" The moment of lightness couldn't last, not with Burton's threat hanging over them like a sword. But it reminded Emma that Jake was more than just a protector or potential romantic interest. He was someone who could make her smile even in desperate circumstances, someone whose presence made the world feel less overwhelming. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we make our stand here, what happens to the children if we lose?" Jake's expression grew grave. "Doc has family in California. Good people who would take them in and love them properly. I've already made arrangements for funds to support them until they're grown." The matter-of-fact way he discussed provision for her siblings' future struck Emma as both admirable and heartbreaking. Jake was planning for their survival even if he didn't live to see it, putting their welfare above his own in ways that reminded her painfully of their father's sacrifice. You've thought of everything. I've had 8 years to plan for dying. It's easier when you have something worth dying for. Emma reached out without conscious thought. Her hand finding his skin was rough from years of mountain work, but his grip was gentle and steady. I don't want you to die for us. I want you to live with us. The words surprised her even as she spoke them. Somewhere in the past few days, Jake Mitchell had become more than a protector or even a potential husband. He had become someone whose continued existence mattered to her personally, independent of what he could provide for her family. Then we better make sure we win, Jake said simply. That evening, as they gathered around the fireplace for what might be their last peaceful night together, Emma found herself studying each face illuminated by the flickering flames. Katie, exhausted by the day's emotional upheaval, had fallen asleep against Jake's shoulder while he carved a small wooden horse for Luke. Tommy sat nearby, cleaning the child-sized rifle Jake had begun teaching him to use. Luke slept peacefully in Emma's arms, his breathing easy and natural for the first time in weeks. They looked like a family, not the conventional family Emma had dreamed of as a girl, but something stronger and more deliberate. A family forged by choice rather than blood, held together by shared purpose rather than mere obligation. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled Emma with terror. She had never had so much to lose, had never cared so deeply about outcomes beyond her immediate control. Loving these people, trusting them with her heart, made her vulnerable in ways that simple physical danger never could. As if sensing her thoughts, Jake looked up from his carving. Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight we're safe. Tonight we're together. Emma nodded, holding Luke closer while watching the fire paint dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Tomorrow would bring Burton and his reinforcements, would force them all to discover whether Jake's confidence was justified or tragically misplaced. But tonight, in this moment, they were exactly what Tommy had identified. A family choosing to take care of each other. It would have to be enough. Part 4. The calm before thunder dawn, on the 5th day brought crystalline clarity to Eagle's Ridge, the kind of mountain morning that made distance seem compressed and details impossibly sharp. Emma woke to find Jake already up, moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency as he prepared for what they all knew would be a decisive day. He had spent the night hours checking and rechecking his defensive preparations, ensuring that every advantage the mountain offered was properly leveraged. Tripwires had been repositioned, ammunition distributed to strategic locations, and escape routes cleared of obstacles. Most importantly, he had prepared a detailed map of alternate paths and safe houses, which he pressed into Emma's hands over breakfast. "Memorize this," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm the children. "If things go badly, take the northern trail to the old mining camp. Doc will have people watching for you there." Emma studied the hand-drawn map, noting Jake's careful attention to landmarks and distances. "You're not coming with us. Someone needs to buy you time to escape. If it comes to that, I'll hold them here as long as possible." The casual way he discussed sacrificing himself for their safety made Emma's stomach clench with fear and anger. There has to be another way. There might be. But if there isn't, I need to know you understand the route. Before Emma could protest further, Tommy appeared at Jake's elbow, his young face grave with premature responsibility. "I've been thinking about the bad men coming back." Jake knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "What about them? They'll try to hurt Emma and the babies to make you give up fighting. That's what bad men do in the stories Mama used to tell." The child's insight was disturbingly accurate. Burton would certainly use the family as leverage against Jake, would threaten or harm them to force surrender. Jake's expression showed that he had already considered this tactic. "That's why we have plans to keep everyone safe," Jake said carefully. "Your job is to help your sister stay calm and follow Emma's instructions exactly." Tommy nodded solemnly. "I won't let them hurt Katie or Luke. I know you won't. You're brave and smart, just like your sister." Emma watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Tommy was growing up too fast, forced to think about violence and sacrifice before his 8th birthday. But Jake's confidence in him was genuine, not patronizing, and the boy responded by standing straighter and speaking with more certainty. Katie remained blissfully unaware of the approaching danger, more interested in the wooden doll Jake had carved for her than in adult conversations about strategy and escape routes. She chattered happily about the doll's adventures, creating elaborate stories that involved rescuing princes and fighting dragons. Her innocence was both precious and fragile, a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. Luke had recovered completely from his fever, babbling contentedly as Emma fed him breakfast. His improvement seemed miraculous after the desperate flight through the wilderness, and Emma credited Jake's care with saving her brother's life. The debt she owed him went far beyond simple gratitude. As the morning progressed, Jake's tension became increasingly evident despite his efforts to remain calm for the children's sake. He checked and rechecked his rifle, studied the approaches to the cabin through his field glasses, and listened constantly for sounds that didn't belong to the natural mountain environment. "When will they come?" Emma asked during a moment when the children were occupied with their games. "Soon. Burton's not the type to let yesterday's humiliation fester. He'll want to restore his reputation quickly, which means overwhelming force applied without warning." "How many men?" 8, maybe 10. Enough to surround the cabin and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Emma felt cold settle in her stomach. "Can you handle that many?" Jake's smile was grim. "In ideal circumstances, from prepared positions, with unlimited ammunition, maybe. But circumstances are rarely ideal, and ammunition isn't unlimited." The honesty of his assessment was both refreshing and terrifying. Jake wasn't boasting about his capabilities or making promises he couldn't keep. He was simply acknowledging the mathematical reality of their situation. "There's still time to run," Emma said quietly. "Where? Crane has resources to track us anywhere in the territory. Running just delays the confrontation while ensuring it happens on ground of his choosing rather than ours." Emma understood the logic, but logic offered little comfort when she imagined Burton's men storming the cabin with her siblings inside. "I keep thinking there should be another option, some solution that doesn't require anyone to die." "Maybe there is. Maybe Burton will realize the cost of taking this place is higher than Crane is willing to pay. Maybe word of what's happening here will reach people who can intervene before violence becomes inevitable." "Do you believe that?" Jake's pause was telling. "I believe in preparing for the worst while hoping for better. It served me well in these mountains." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, still distant but unmistakably real. Jake moved immediately to his observation post, field glasses trained on the valley below. His expression hardened as he studied the approaching force. 12 riders. Burton's brought everything he could scrape together on short notice. Jake lowered the glasses, his face grim. "They're not coming to negotiate." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do we do?" "You take the children to the root cellar. Stay there until either I come for you, or you hear 3 shots followed by silence. If that happens, use the northern escape route, and don't look back." "Jake." "No arguments. This is what we planned for." Emma wanted to protest, wanted to find some way to share the danger rather than hiding while he faced it alone. But the children's safety had to come first, and Jake was right about the tactical situation. Her presence would only divide his attention and compromise their defensive position. She gathered Tommy, Katie, and Luke quickly, explaining in calm tones that they needed to go to the special hiding place Jake had prepared. Tommy understood immediately, his face setting in lines of determination that reminded Emma painfully of their father. Katie accepted the explanation without question, still clutching her wooden doll. Luke remained cheerfully oblivious, making happy sounds as Emma settled him in the concealed cellar. The root cellar was larger than Emma had expected, carved from solid rock and lined with shelves that held preserved food and emergency supplies. Jake had clearly spent considerable time preparing this refuge, ensuring it could sustain them for days if necessary. Oil lamps provided steady light, while carefully positioned air vents ensured adequate ventilation. Stay quiet, Emma whispered to the children as she settled them on blankets Jake had placed for their comfort. No matter what you hear above us, stay quiet until I say otherwise. Tommy nodded, understanding. Katie curled up with her doll, already treating this as an adventure rather than mortal danger. Luke dozed peacefully, finally healthy enough to sleep without distress. Emma positioned herself near the concealed entrance, where she could listen to events in the cabin above. The heavy wooden floor muffled sounds, but she could still hear Jake's movements as he took up his defensive position. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the clearing, followed immediately by answering fire from multiple weapons. The attack had begun. Through the floorboards above, Emma could hear the methodical rhythm of Jake's return fire, each shot carefully aimed and spaced. He wasn't panicking or wasting ammunition, but fighting with the controlled precision of someone who understood that every bullet had to count. The attacker's fire was less disciplined, chattering bursts that spoke of men trying to overwhelm their target through volume rather than accuracy. Bullets thudded into the cabin's log walls, but the structure Jake had built was solid enough to stop anything short of artillery. Katie whimpered at the sound of gunfire, and Emma gathered the little girl close, whispering reassurances while her own heart hammered with terror. Tommy sat rigid with concentration, clearly trying to follow the battle by sound alone. Luke slept on, mercifully unaware of the violence raging above them. The firing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Emma could track Jake's position by the sound of his rifle, noting with relief that he was still mobile and apparently uninjured. But the sustained nature of the attack suggested that Burton's men had taken cover and settled in for a siege. Then the shooting stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow more frightening than the previous chaos. Emma strained to hear any sound from above, any indication of what was happening in the world beyond their hiding place. A voice called out from somewhere outside the cabin, harsh and commanding. "Mitchell, you're surrounded and outnumbered. Send out the woman and children, and we'll let you walk away from this." Jake's response was immediate and contemptuous. "The only thing walking away from here will be whatever's left of you after I'm done shooting. Look around, Mitchell. We've got men on all sides. You can't hold this position forever. Don't need forever, just need long enough." Emma wondered what Jake meant by that cryptic response. Long enough for what? Did he have reinforcements coming, or was he simply playing for time while planning some desperate gambit? Burton's voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "Last chance, Mitchell. Surrender now, and nobody else has to die." "Somebody's going to die," Jake replied. "Question is how many of your men you want to sacrifice for Crane's money." The negotiation, such as it was, ended there. Emma heard movement above as Jake changed positions, probably responding to some new threat or opportunity. The silence stretched on, filled with tension that seemed to press against the cellar walls like a living thing. Then Katie spoke, her small voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. "Emma, I need to use the privy." Emma's heart sank. Of all the times for childhood necessity to assert itself, this was the worst possible moment. But Katie was only 5 years old, and fear often affected children in unpredictable ways. "Can you wait a little longer?" Emma whispered. Katie's face showed the distress of someone fighting a losing battle against biological urgency. "I don't think so." Emma considered their options. The cellar had been supplied with water and food, but Jake hadn't thought to include chamber pot facilities. If Katie couldn't wait, they would have to risk exposure by leaving their hiding place. Before Emma could decide how to handle this crisis, the sound of renewed gunfire erupted above them. This time the shooting was more scattered, suggesting movement and confusion rather than the previous disciplined exchange. Something had changed in the tactical situation.
Through the chaos of gunshots and shouting, Emma heard Jake's voice raised in what sounded like encouragement or command. But his words were directed outward, not toward their hiding place, which meant other people had joined the fight. The battle raged for several more minutes before gradually tapering off into sporadic shots and distant calls. Emma held her breath, trying to interpret the meaning of each sound. Had Jake's mysterious reinforcements arrived? Were Burton's men retreating or regrouping? Finally, blessed silence returned to the clearing above. Emma waited, following Jake's instructions to remain hidden until he came for them personally. But the quiet stretched on without any sign of resolution, without the three-shot signal that would tell her to flee with the children. Then footsteps crossed the cabin floor above them, heavy and deliberate. Emma's heart hammered as she tried to determine whether the walker was friend or enemy. The steps paused directly over their hiding place, and Emma heard the scrape of furniture being moved aside. "Emma?" Jake's voice, rough with exhaustion but unmistakably alive. "It's safe now. You can come up." Emma nearly sobbed with relief as she helped the children climb out of their underground refuge. Jake's face showed the strain of battle, with powder burns on his cheek and a slight graze on his left arm. But he was whole and unhurt. "Is it over?" Emma asked. "This part is over. Burton's dead, and his surviving men are in full retreat. But we need to talk about what comes next." Emma looked around the cabin, noting the bullet holes in the walls and the broken glass from shot-out windows. Despite the damage, Jake's fortress had held, and her family was safe. "How?" she asked simply. Jake's smile was tired but genuine. "Seems like Doc wasn't the only one watching for trouble. Half the county showed up to help, including some federal marshals who were very interested in those documents you've been carrying." Emma felt the world shift around her, the constant tension of the past weeks finally beginning to ease. "It's really over? The immediate danger is over. Crane's finished, his organization scattered. You're free to live wherever you choose, to raise your family however you see fit." The words should have filled Emma with joy, but instead she felt an unexpected sadness. Freedom meant choices, and choices meant the possibility of leaving this mountain sanctuary that had become more home than refuge. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. Jake's expression was carefully neutral. "I haven't decided yet. Depends on whether anyone wants an old mountain hermit as permanent company." Emma looked around the damaged cabin, thinking of all the ways it had sheltered and protected them. Then she looked at Jake, remembering his gentle care with Luke, his patient teaching with Tommy, his playful attention to Katie's stories. "I think," she said slowly, "that this mountain hermit might find he has more permanent company than he expected." Jake's face lit with hope. "Are you sure? It's isolated here, and winters are hard. The children would grow up far from schools and social opportunities. The children would grow up loved and safe and free. Sometimes that matters more than social opportunities." Before Jake could respond, Katie tugged at Emma's skirt. "Does this mean we're staying? Does this mean Jake is going to be our new papa?" Emma looked at Jake, seeing the question reflected in his weathered features. "What do you think? Would you like Jake to be your new papa?" Katie's answer was immediate and emphatic. "Yes, and then he can marry you, and we'll be a real family." Emma felt heat flood her cheeks. "Katie, that's not how these things work." "Why not?" Tommy asked, appearing at his sister's side. "He takes care of us like a papa, and you like him like mamas like papas in stories." Emma found herself looking at Jake helplessly, overwhelmed by the children's direct approach to complex adult emotions. Jake's expression showed equal parts amusement and hope. "Your siblings make compelling arguments," he said quietly. "The question is whether you agree with their assessment." Emma thought of the past week, of Jake's gentle strength and steady protection. She thought of his patient teaching and genuine care for her family. Most importantly, she thought of how safe and valued he made her feel, how his presence transformed survival into something approaching happiness. "I think," she said carefully, "that some decisions are too important to make quickly." Jake nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. We've got nothing but time now." But even as Emma spoke of taking time for careful consideration, she found herself thinking that perhaps the children understood something adults often missed. Perhaps the best foundations for lasting love were built not from grand romantic gestures but from daily acts of care and protection. Perhaps choosing family was less about perfect timing, and more about recognizing when someone had already become essential to your happiness. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, a possibility that shimmered with promise and risk in equal measure. Part 5. Hearts on the Mountain. The days following Burton's defeat took on a dreamlike quality.
as if the sudden absence of danger had left them all slightly adrift in a world where happiness was actually possible. Federal marshals came and went, taking custody of Emma's evidence and ensuring that Crane's network of corruption would face proper justice. The threat that had driven them into the mountains was truly over. But with safety came new questions and possibilities that seemed almost more challenging than the previous life or death struggles. Emma found herself watching Jake with new awareness, noting the way morning light caught the silver in his hair, the careful gentleness of his hands when he helped Luke with his breakfast, the patient attention he gave to Tommy's endless questions about mountain wildlife. Jake, for his part, seemed determined to give Emma all the space she needed to make her decision about their future. He continued caring for the children with devoted attention, but he was careful not to pressure her with romantic gestures or declarations of love. Instead, he simply demonstrated through daily actions what life together might look like. It was a courtship conducted in domestic moments rather than grand gestures. Jake teaching Katie to identify different bird songs. Jake and Tommy working together to repair the cabin's bullet-damaged walls. Jake patiently feeding Luke when the toddler decided to be difficult about eating. Jake listening to Emma's concerns about the children's education and suggesting correspondence courses that could supplement mountain learning. Emma found herself falling in love not with dramatic romance, but with the quiet reliability of someone who showed up consistently for the people he cared about. Jake never promised perfection or easy solutions, but he offered something more valuable, the certainty that he would face whatever challenges arose alongside them. The realization crept up on her gradually, built from accumulated moments of trust and comfort. She was in love with Jake Mitchell, not just as a protector or provider, but as a man whose presence made her world feel complete in ways she hadn't known were possible. The knowledge both elated and terrified her. Love made you vulnerable, gave you everything to lose. Emma had watched their parents' marriage, had seen how deeply her father's death had wounded their mother. Was she prepared to risk that kind of pain? Was she strong enough to love someone completely while knowing that loss was always possible? These questions swirled through her mind as autumn deepened across Eagle's Ridge. Jake had been right about the mountain's beauty. The aspen trees turned brilliant gold, while the pine trees remained steadfast green, creating a tapestry of color that took Emma's breath away. This was a place where beauty and hardship existed in perfect balance, where survival required both strength and appreciation for small gifts. 2 weeks after Burton's attack, Emma was gathering firewood when she heard unfamiliar voices approaching the cabin. Her heart jumped with instinctive alarm before she recognized the calm tenor of Jake's responses. Visitors, not threats. She returned to the clearing to find Jake deep in conversation with an older woman dressed in practical traveling clothes. The woman's bearing suggested authority and education, but her manner was warm rather than intimidating. Emma, Jake called as she approached. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Adelaide Thornton. She's a territorial education inspector here to discuss schooling options for the children." Mrs. Thornton's handshake was firm and her smile genuine. "Mr. Mitchell has been telling me about your family's situation. I understand you're concerned about the children's educational opportunities while living in such a remote location." Emma glanced at Jake, surprised and touched that he had thought to contact education authorities without her asking. "Yes, I worry that mountain isolation might limit their future opportunities." A valid concern, but not insurmountable. "I've worked with many frontier families who've successfully educated their children through combination methods. Correspondence courses, seasonal terms with town schools, private tutoring during winter months when travel is difficult." Mrs. Thornton spent the afternoon evaluating the children's current knowledge and discussing educational plans. Tommy proved to be remarkably advanced in mathematics and natural sciences, thanks to their father's teaching and his own curiosity. Katie showed artistic talents that could be nurtured through specialized materials and instruction. Even Luke, at barely 2 years old, demonstrated cognitive development that suggested strong intellectual potential. "Your children are bright and eager to learn," Mrs. Thornton concluded. "With proper support, mountain education could actually provide advantages over conventional schooling. Direct observation of natural phenomena, practical application of mathematical concepts,
Development of Self-Reliance and Critical Thinking Skills. Part 4. The Promise Under Mountain Stars. The first snowfall of the season arrived 3 weeks later, transforming Eagles Ridge into a crystalline wonderland that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Emma stood at the cabin window, watching fat snowflakes drift past the glass while Luke played contentedly at her feet, and the older children worked on their correspondence lessons at the kitchen table. Jake had been gone since dawn, checking his trap lines and hunting for winter meat. The absence that had once filled Emma with anxiety now felt natural, temporary. She knew he would return before nightfall, would stamp the snow from his boots and hang his coat by the fire, would gather them all close to hear about his day in the high country. The transformation in their daily life still amazed her. What had begun as desperate flight had evolved into something approaching domestic bliss. The children thrived under Jake's patient guidance and her own fierce protection. They were growing stronger, more confident, more secure in their place in the world. Tommy had shot his first rabbit the previous week, a clean kill that had filled him with pride, and Jake with quiet satisfaction. Katie had memorized dozens of songs that Jake sang while working, her clear voice echoing through the cabin during evening gatherings. Luke had taken his first independent steps, tottering from Emma's arms to Jake's with the fearless determination of a child who knew he would be caught. But it was the quiet moments that revealed the depth of their transformation. Jake reading to the children by firelight, his deep voice bringing stories to life. Emma and Jake working side by side to prepare meals, their movements synchronized by growing familiarity. The four of them curled together during evening storytelling, a tangle of arms and shared warmth that spoke of belonging. Emma had made her decision weeks ago, had known in her heart that this mountain, this man, this life was what she wanted for herself and her siblings. But saying the words aloud, making the commitment official, seemed to require a moment of perfect clarity that hadn't yet arrived. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Jake appeared through the swirling snow, moving with the easy grace of someone completely at home in winter conditions. He carried a string of rabbits and wore the satisfied expression of a successful hunt. "Storm's getting stronger," he announced as he entered the cabin, bringing cold air and snowflakes with him. "We'll be snowed in for a few days, but we've got plenty of supplies." The prospect of being trapped together in the cabin didn't alarm any of them anymore. They had learned to navigate each other's moods and needs, had developed routines that allowed privacy within shared space. If anything, the approaching storm felt cozy rather than confining. That evening, as wind howled around the cabin and snow piled against the windows, they gathered around the fireplace for their customary storytelling time. Jake had been working his way through adventure tales that kept the children enthralled, stories of brave explorers and distant lands that sparked their imaginations. But tonight, instead of opening his usual book, Jake set it aside and looked directly at Emma. "I have a different kind of story tonight," he said quietly. "A true story about a man who thought his life was over, who believed he had nothing left worth living for." Emma's breath caught. This was not a children's tale, but something far more personal and significant. This man lived alone on a mountain, convinced that solitude was safer than connection, that protecting his heart was more important than opening it to possibility. Jake's voice carried the careful control of someone choosing words with deliberate precision. He told himself that isolation was noble, that he was sparing the world from his failures. Katie shifted closer to Jake, sensing the importance of this story even if she didn't understand its implications. Tommy watched with the intense attention he brought to anything Jake considered significant. Luke dozed peacefully in Emma's arms, trusting in the safety of their circle. Then one day this man encountered people who needed help. A brave woman protecting her family, children who deserved safety and love, and the chance to grow up without fear. Jake's eyes never left Emma's face. At first he told himself he was just providing temporary assistance, that he would help them and then return to his safe, empty life. Emma felt tears building behind her eyes, understanding that Jake was telling their story, was putting their journey into words that transformed it from mere survival into something approaching legend. But the longer these people stayed,
the more the man realized that his mountain fortress had become a home. That his careful solitude had been loneliness in disguise. That protecting his heart had left it withered rather than safe. Jake stood slowly, moving to kneel beside Emma's chair. The gesture was so reminiscent of their first meeting that Emma's heart began racing with anticipation and memory. The man discovered that love isn't about avoiding loss, but about choosing connection despite the risks. That family isn't just blood but bonds forged by choice and strengthened by shared trials. Jake's voice grew softer, more intimate, and he realized that he wanted to spend whatever time he had left protecting and cherishing the people who had brought light back into his darkness. Emma could barely breathe. This was the moment she had been waiting for without realizing it. The perfect clarity she had needed to make her choice official and irrevocable. "Emma Walsh," Jake said formally, his weathered hands reaching for hers. "Would you and your family do me the honor of becoming mine permanently? Would you marry me and help me turn this fortress into a true home?" The question hung in the air like mountain mist, beautiful and transformative. Emma looked into Jake's eyes and saw 8 years of loneliness transformed into hope. Saw a future built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, unconsciously echoing the words she had spoken during their first desperate encounter. Jake's response was immediate and fervent. "Never. I would rather cut off my own hands than cause you one moment's pain." "Then yes," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, we'll be your family. Yes to all of it." Katie erupted in delighted squeals, bouncing with excitement. Tommy grinned with satisfaction, as if he had orchestrated this outcome through sheer force of will. Luke woke long enough to clap his hands at the general celebration before returning to peaceful sleep. Jake's relief was palpable, his shoulders sagging as if he had been holding his breath for weeks. "Are you certain? Mountain winters are long and hard. There will be times when we're completely cut off from the outside world." "I'm certain," Emma replied firmly. "This mountain gave us shelter when we needed it most. You gave us protection when no one else would. Now we choose to give you our hearts willingly, permanently." Jake leaned forward to kiss her gently, a soft touch that sealed their commitment with tenderness rather than passion. It was a promise of things to come, of a lifetime of such moments shared in the firelight of their mountain home. "When?" Katie demanded, ever practical despite her excitement. Jake and Emma looked at each other, suddenly aware that they had committed to marriage without discussing any of the practical details. In their isolated situation, traditional wedding arrangements seemed both impossible and unnecessary. "Spring," Emma decided. "When the wild flowers bloom and we can have Doc Harrison perform the ceremony properly." "Spring is months away," Tommy protested. "That's too long to wait." Jake laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "Your sister is right about doing this properly. Besides, it will give us time to prepare, to make sure this is what everyone wants." But even as they discussed timeline and details, Emma knew that the real commitment had already been made. They were already a family in every way that mattered, bound by choice and tested by adversity. The wedding ceremony would simply make official what their hearts had already decided. Over the following days, as the storm raged outside, and they remained cocooned in their mountain sanctuary, the dynamic within the cabin shifted subtly but significantly. Jake no longer held himself apart from domestic decisions, no longer treated himself as a temporary caretaker. Emma stopped second-guessing his authority with the children, stopped maintaining the careful distance of someone prepared to leave. They began planning, not just for the wedding, but for their long-term future together. Jake spoke of expanding the cabin to give the children individual rooms as they grew older. Emma suggested starting a more extensive garden that could provide fresh vegetables throughout the brief mountain summer. They discussed education plans, potential trips to town for supplies and social contact, the possibility of additional children born to their union. Most importantly, they began building the deep intimacy that sustained lasting marriages. Not just physical attraction, though that certainly existed, but the profound compatibility of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They talked for hours by the firelight while the children slept, sharing stories of their past lives and dreams for their future together. Jake told Emma about his childhood in the valley below, about learning carpentry from his father and hunting from his grandfather. He spoke of his business ventures before Anna's death, of the satisfaction he had found in building things that would last for generations. He revealed his fears about being a good husband and father, about whether his years of isolation had damaged his ability to live harmoniously with others. Emma shared her own memories of growing up in a mining family, of the financial struggles that had shaped her practical approach to life. She spoke of her parents' love for each other and their children, of the lessons about resilience and sacrifice that had prepared her for their current challenges. She admitted her own fears about trusting completely, about allowing herself to depend on someone else's strength and protection. These conversations deepened their understanding of each other and strengthened their conviction that they were making the right choice. They were not rushing into marriage based on gratitude or convenience, but building a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that could support a lifetime together. The children adapted to the changing family dynamic with the flexibility of youth. Tommy began calling Jake Pa, without prompting, the title sliding naturally into his vocabulary, as if it had always belonged there. Katie included Jake in her elaborate doll-playing scenarios, assigning him roles that required patience and imagination. Luke, too young for complex understanding, simply accepted Jake's constant presence as natural and right. Most tellingly, the children began planning their own roles in the upcoming wedding, with the enthusiasm of people who felt genuinely included in the family's future. Katie appointed herself flower girl and began practicing walking with dignified slowness. Tommy declared his intention to stand with Jake during the ceremony, a best man ready to support his new father's most important moment. As the storm finally cleared and sunlight returned to Eagle's Ridge, Emma found herself standing once again at the cabin window, but with entirely different feelings than before. Instead of watching for approaching danger, she was simply appreciating the beauty of her chosen home. Instead of counting the days until they could leave, she was savoring the knowledge that they never had to leave again. Jake appeared beside her, slipping his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. Together they watched the children play in the fresh snow, their laughter echoing off the mountain peaks like music. "Any regrets?" Jake asked quietly. Emma leaned back against his solid warmth, marveling at how right this felt. "Only that it took us so long to find each other. Maybe we found each other exactly when we were supposed to. Maybe all the pain and loss were necessary to bring us to this moment." Emma considered this perspective, thinking of the unlikely chain of events that had led them from desperate flight to domestic happiness. If her parents hadn't died, if Crane hadn't forced her into marriage, if Jake hadn't been watching the valley that particular morning, none of this would have happened. "Do you really believe that? That everything happens for a reason?" Jake was quiet for a moment, watching Tommy help Katie build a snow fort while Luke toddled between them with delighted squeals. "I believe that good people find ways to create meaning from whatever circumstances they face. Whether that's fate or choice doesn't matter as much as the outcome." Emma nodded, satisfied with this practical approach to life's mysteries. She had spent enough time trying to understand why bad things happen to good people. Now she preferred to focus on how good people responded to whatever challenges they encountered. Spring arrived early that year, bringing wild flowers and warm breezes that transformed Eagle's Ridge into something approaching paradise. Doc Harrison made the difficult journey up the mountain trail, accompanied by Mrs. Thornton and several other friends who had supported them during their darkest hours. The wedding ceremony took place in the clearing, where Emma had first begged Jake not to hurt her, where he had dropped to his knees to offer protection instead of threat. Now he knelt again, but this time to place a simple gold band on her finger, while promising to love and protect her family for all the days of his life. Emma's own vows focused on gratitude and choice, on the miraculous transformation of their lives through love and determination. She promised to build a home worthy of his protection, to raise their children with the values of courage and compassion they had both learned through hardship. The children participated enthusiastically, Katie scattering wildflower petals with ceremonial seriousness, while Tommy stood proudly beside Jake. Luke, now steady on his feet, toddled between the adults with the confidence of someone who knew he belonged exactly where he was. As Doc Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, Emma felt the final pieces of her new life clicking into place. She was no longer Emma Walsh, desperate refugee protecting her siblings through constant flight. She was Emma Mitchell, beloved wife and mother, valued member of a family built on choice rather than obligation. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt, featuring a feast prepared from their mountain garden and Jake's hunting successes. Doc Harrison regaled them with stories from town, including news that Crane's conviction had sent shockwaves through territorial politics. Mrs. Thornton presented the children with advanced correspondence materials that would support their education through the coming year. Most importantly, their friends' presence validated the family they had become, confirming that their mountain fortress was not a hiding place but a genuine home, worthy of celebration and recognition. As evening fell and their guests prepared for the journey back to town, Emma found herself alone with Jake for the first time as his wife. The children were exhausted from the day's excitement, sleeping peacefully in their beds. The cabin glowed with lamplight and contentment. "No regrets?" Jake asked again, echoing his question from the storm-bound days. Emma looked around their home, seeing it through new eyes. The bullet holes in the walls had been carefully repaired, but she could still see faint scars that reminded her of how far they had traveled together. The furniture Jake had built for his solitary life now accommodated a family's needs. The kitchen that had once prepared meals for one now served as the heart of their domestic life. Only that Anna never got to see what a wonderful husband and father you became, Emma said softly. She would have been so proud of the man you are. Jake's eyes misted at this acknowledgement of his lost love. I think she would have liked you. You both have the same fierce protectiveness for the people you love. Emma nodded, comfortable with sharing Jake's heart with Anna's memory. Love was not a finite resource that diminished with sharing, but something that grew stronger when honored and remembered properly. What do you think our children will remember about this time? Emma asked, thinking of Tommy, Katie, and Luke sleeping peacefully nearby. I think they'll remember that when bad things happened, good people stepped forward to help. That families can be created through choice, as well as birth. That love is stronger than fear when people are brave enough to risk their hearts. Emma smiled, thinking of the stories they would tell their grandchildren someday. Not fairy tales about perfect people in perfect circumstances, but true stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when protecting those they loved. Outside their window, Eagle's Ridge settled into peaceful night, under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The mountain that had sheltered them during their darkest hours now stood guard over their brightest dreams, a fortress of stone and pine that would protect their family for generations to come. Emma Mitchell fell asleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the quiet breathing of children who called her Mama and him Papa, secure in the knowledge that love had indeed conquered all the darkness that had once threatened to destroy them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was perfect in its simple completion. Their story had begun with a desperate plea for mercy and evolved into a promise of forever. Sometimes the most beautiful endings were really just the beginning of something even more wonderful. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.